I never imagined that my life in Lagos would take the kind of turn it eventually did, because when I first met Lydia, she seemed like the one person who could steady the chaos around me, and I held on to that thought every single day. I remember the heat of that first afternoon we spoke, the smell of roasted corn and fried plantain in the air, and how she smiled like she had been waiting all along for me to come into her life, and I believed destiny had arranged it that way. I was not a man of great wealth, but I had dreams and I had ambition, and Lydia always said that was enough for her, so I trusted her words more than I trusted my own instincts. Lagos can be unforgiving, and yet when I held her hand, I felt like even the relentless noise of Danfoss honking at Ojuelegba and the shouts of traders at Balogun Market faded into a kind of silence only lovers can understand. She loved to sit with me under the flickering orange streetlights of Surulere, whispering plans for the future, promising that no matter how rough the journey became, she would walk with me through it all. I thought I had found the partner I had prayed for, the one who would never let go even if storms shook everything I owned. That thought carried me through long nights of work, when the city refused to sleep and I had to fight to carve out even the smallest corner of comfort for us. I told myself that Lydia's faith in me was unshakable, that her laughter was a vow that she would never betray, and that her eyes were too sincere to ever hide deceit. My friends used to tease me that Lagos women could never be trusted, that beauty in this city was too often a mask for something darker, but I defended Lydia like my life depended on it. I told them she was not like the rest, that she was unique, that she had chosen me when others had doubted me, and so I owed her my loyalty without condition. Even when rumors drifted my way like smoke, whispering that she had been seen laughing too closely with another man, I brushed them aside because I believed love deserved trust until proven otherwise. Each morning I woke before dawn to chase contracts, to sit in endless meetings, to squeeze money out of a system that always seemed stacked against men like me, and Lydia would still be curled up in bed when I left, her face soft with sleep. I would watch her for a moment before stepping into the humid Lagos air, convincing myself that every sacrifice was worth it as long as it kept her happy. My chest swelled with pride whenever she told her friends about how hard I worked, and I mistook her words for genuine admiration rather than rehearsed lines masking a different truth. On weekends we would stroll by the lagoon, buying suya from the roadside and laughing like two people untouched by the weight of the city. And I told myself those moments were proof that nothing could ever come between us. At night, when we lay in darkness, I whispered my dreams of building a home big enough to fit the family we had not yet started, and she would squeeze my hand and say, "I believe in you, David." Those words became the fuel that kept me pushing even when exhaustion burned in my bones. Every time doubt crept in, I remembered her voice, and it felt like armor against failure. When neighbors gossiped or questioned her loyalty, I silenced them because I thought no outsider could know what we shared better than I did. I lived for her approval, I worked for her comfort, and I breathed for her love, certain that we were unshakable in a city that tested everyone's limits. I built my world around Lydia, never imagining that she could ever be the one to break it. I didn't realize that love could blind a man so completely that he would ignore the obvious signs even when they stood right in front of him, waving their hands like street hawkers in Maryland traffic. I should have noticed how her phone suddenly became an extension of her body, always face down, always locked, always guarded like a state secret no one was allowed to see. I should have questioned why she no longer smiled the same way when I walked into the room, why her laughter came easier when she was chatting with people I didn't know, and why her hugs began to feel like obligations rather than reflexes of affection. I thought it was stress. I thought maybe Lagos life was weighing on her, the same way it weighed on me, and I told myself that patience would heal whatever cracks were forming in the silence between us. But silence can be louder than thunder when two people share a bed but sleep on opposite sides of the truth. I started coming home earlier just to spend more time with her, thinking maybe quality time would restore what was slipping through my fingers like sand, and she would smile briefly and ask if I wanted food, but her eyes said something else entirely. I told myself not to overthink it, because overthinking ruins love, and I had already vowed to protect ours from doubt. I remembered how she used to run to hug me when I came back tired, how she would loosen my tie playfully and kiss my cheek, and I clung to those memories like a desperate man clings to a floating plank after a shipwreck. I held on to the idea that love, once true, could not fade without warning, but the truth is that love can bleed slowly without anyone noticing until the floor is wet with consequences. I started waking up at night to find her awake, scrolling through her phone with that faint smile she no longer wore for me. And whenever I asked who she was chatting with, she would say it was just a friend or a cousin who needed advice. I believed her because disbelief would mean admitting that the world I built was cracking from the inside, and I wasn't ready to face that reality. I should have asked deeper questions. I should have followed my instincts. I should have demanded honesty before lies took root, but I was too busy protecting the image of us instead of the substance. There were days I would take her out to eat at Yellow Chili or drive her to Ikeja City Mall just to see her eyes light up the way they used to, but she seemed distracted, always texting under the table or stepping outside to take calls she claimed were about work. I convinced myself that maybe I was acting paranoid, that true love required trust even when things felt uncomfortable, and so I swallowed my suspicions like bitter medicine. My mother once told me that a woman's heart is a river that can change direction quietly, and if you don't pay attention, you will one day find yourself standing on dry land where water once flowed effortlessly, and I think about her words now with a kind of pain that lives in my bones. I remember the first time Lydia forgot to say, "I love you," before bed, and when I mentioned it jokingly the next morning, she laughed awkwardly and said she was tired, and I pretended that explanation was enough. That's the thing about denial. It wraps itself around your mind like a soft blanket, making you believe you are warm when in fact your house is on fire. I started noticing how she dressed differently when she claimed she was going to see her friends, how her perfume lingered longer than usual, how her hair and makeup were done with a level of care reserved for moments that mattered more than casual outings. But each time doubt tapped me on the shoulder, I brushed it off and reminded myself that accusing a good woman without proof was the beginning of relationship rot. I didn't want to be that kind of man, the insecure type Lagos people mock for monitoring his wife like a security guard. I thought being trusting and calm made me strong, but sometimes strength is just fear wearing confidence like a disguise. My friends would ask when Lydia and I planned to have children, and I would laugh and tell them it would happen when the time was right. But secretly I wondered if she still saw me as the man she wanted to build a family with. I remember lying awake some nights listening to the generators humming outside and thinking that something had shifted between us, something I could not name but could feel like humidity pressing against my skin. I tried to pray about it, asking God to guide me, to reveal anything that was hidden in the shadows of our home, but I also prayed that my suspicions were wrong, because I didn't know how to live in a world where Lydia was not my safe place. I held on to the belief that love, if nurtured, could survive anything, but I didn't realize that love cannot survive alone when the other person is already halfway out the door in their heart. I remember one weekend when we stayed at a short-let apartment in Lekki to relax, hoping a change of environment would heal whatever was broken, and even though we laughed and took pictures, there was an invisible wall between us that no kiss could break. I kept telling myself that phases like this were normal, that couples had ups and downs, and that eventually everything would return to how it used to be if I just remained patient. But love is not always a patient man's reward. Sometimes it is the thing that blinds you to betrayal until you walk straight into heartbreak with open arms. I didn't know that I was already living in the shadow of deception, that someone else had quietly stepped into the space I thought belonged only to me. I didn't know that the woman I trusted more than anyone had already started giving away pieces of herself that she once promised were mine alone. I didn't know that while I was working overtime to build a future for us, she was spending her emotional currencies somewhere I had no access to, somewhere she guarded carefully behind lies and half-truths. If I had known then what I know now, maybe I would have confronted the unease sooner. Maybe I would have asked harder questions. Maybe I would have protected my heart instead of handing it over without conditions. But the past cannot be edited like a document on a screen. It remains etched into memory like Danfo slogans painted boldly in yellow and red. I carried on, loving her with a faith that was almost foolish, trusting her with a devotion that bordered on worship, and hoping that tomorrow would erase the doubts crouching in the corners of my mind. I never imagined betrayal could wear the face of the one you kiss goodnight, the one you cook for, the one you defend against the world. I didn't know, but I was about to learn in the most painful way that love does not always shield you from heartbreak. Sometimes it delivers you to it gently, smiling all the while. I kept telling myself that nothing was wrong, even though my instincts refused to stay quiet. And every time Lydia brushed past me in the hallway with that distant look in her eyes, I felt something tightening in my chest, but I pretended not to notice, because denial can be comforting when the truth threatens to rearrange your life. I woke up earlier than usual one Tuesday and saw her standing by the window, clutching her phone like it was something sacred. And when I asked her who she was chatting with, she simply said it was a work message, but her voice sounded like someone rehearsing a lie. I tried to laugh it off and joked that she was becoming too important for the rest of us, and she smiled in that automatic way that doesn't reach the heart, then tucked her phone under her pillow like she didn't want the light from the screen to expose something. That morning, while I got ready for work, she hummed a tune I didn't recognize, and though her voice was sweet, it carried a kind of detachment, the kind that doesn't accompany genuine peace, and I found myself staring at her reflection in the mirror longer than usual. As I tied my shoes, I noticed she had dressed up more than necessary for someone who claimed she was working from home that day, and when I asked if she had plans to go out, she said she might step out to pick a parcel. I didn't question it further because I didn't want to sound insecure, but something about the way she avoided my eyes made the air feel heavier. On my way to the office through the busy streets of Lagos, I kept replaying the morning in my head, trying to convince myself that I was only being paranoid, and by the time I arrived at my desk, I forced my mind to focus on pending tasks, deadlines, and meetings. During lunch break, I called Lydia just to hear her voice, and when she picked up, I could hear faint car horns in the background, even though she had said she'd be at home, and when I casually asked where she was, she said she had stepped out to buy fruit. I pretended not to notice the inconsistency in her story and told her to get something sweet for herself, and she replied with a soft laugh that lacked warmth. When I got home that evening, she was already there, wearing different clothes than the ones she had on in the morning, and her hair was tied up like she had been somewhere that required effort. I asked her how her day went, and she said it was fine, uneventful, and a little tiring, but she didn't mention any parcel or fruit, and I didn't bring it up because silence sometimes feels safer than confrontation. That night, as we ate dinner, she barely looked at me, and I caught her glancing at her phone every few seconds, as if waiting for something or someone to interrupt our quiet table. I tried to start a conversation about plans for the weekend, but she only gave short answers, and after a while I stopped talking because I felt like I was speaking to a painting instead of a person. When we went to bed, she turned her back to me faster than she used to, and though I reached out to touch her arm, she mumbled something about being exhausted and pulled the blanket up to her neck. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of distant generators outside and wondering when our home started feeling like separate rooms under one roof. The next day, I decided to observe more carefully without making it obvious, so I paid attention to her patterns, her expressions, and the tone she used when speaking to me. I noticed she started locking her phone more frequently, and she set a new password she didn't bother to mention, even though we never hid such things from each other before. In the evenings, she stepped outside to take calls instead of answering them in my presence, and each time I asked who it was, she would casually say it was one of her cousins or a colleague with a tight deadline. One Thursday evening, I came home earlier than usual due to a cancelled meeting, and I found Lydia sitting on the couch with her phone pressed so close to her face you'd think she was afraid the words might run away. And as soon as she heard the door open, she jumped a little and minimized the screen. I pretended not to see the panic in her eyes and greeted her with a smile that felt strange on my own face, then dropped my keys on the table and went to wash my hands. She followed me into the kitchen and offered to make tea, even though she rarely did that on weekdays, and I sensed the offer had more to do with distracting me than actual kindness. When the kettle began to boil, she excused herself to the bedroom for a moment, saying she needed to check something, and I could hear the muffled sound of buttons tapping quickly. Later that night, when she went to shower, she left her phone charging on the nightstand, and for a brief moment I considered picking it up just to confirm or disprove the growing knot in my stomach, but something inside me resisted because I wanted to believe her without invading her privacy. As she came out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel, she glanced at the spot where her phone lay as if checking to ensure it hadn't been touched, and I pretended to be engrossed in a football highlight on my phone. Over the next few days, I noticed she spent longer hours getting ready, even when she claimed she wasn't going anywhere important, and the subtle scent of a new perfume lingered on her clothes. She said she bought it during a discount sale, but when I asked from which store, she hesitated before mentioning a shop that had closed months ago. I let the lie slip past my lips without challenge, but the unease inside me kept growing roots. One Saturday, she told me she needed to visit her friend Nkechi, who had just had a baby, and since I knew Nkechi well, I didn't think much of it. But I casually called Nkechi that afternoon to congratulate her, and she sounded surprised that I thought Lydia was with her. I didn't confront Lydia when she returned home later that evening, looking unusually radiant, but something inside me shifted like a part of my trust, quietly stepping back from the edge. I started remembering little things I had ignored, missed calls labeled with strange initials, sudden trips to the salon, unexplained bank transfers, and that faraway look she wore like a secret. When I mentioned the idea of having a weekend getaway together to rekindle some spark, she dismissed it quickly, saying work was too demanding and travel would only stress her. I wondered when spending time together became stressful, but I kept my voice calm and pretended to understand like a good husband who doesn't want to be seen as clingy. One afternoon, I arrived home to pick up a forgotten file and saw a male jacket draped over the back of the dining chair, a jacket that wasn't mine and didn't belong to any of our relatives, and for a moment my heartbeat drowned out the sounds of the neighborhood outside. Before I could inspect it, Lydia came out of the bedroom looking startled, and she quickly grabbed the jacket and said it belonged to her brother Tunde, who had stopped by earlier. I nodded slowly, even though Tunde lived in Port Harcourt and hadn't visited Lagos in years, but I acted like I believed her, because challenging her would have revealed just how much attention I had been paying. After that day, her behavior became even more careful, and I realized she must have noticed my growing suspicions because she started over-explaining little things and asking unusual questions about my schedule. Each time she touched my arm or smiled at me, it felt rehearsed, like lines learned from a script written to disguise something rotting beneath the surface. I found myself studying her voice for cracks, her eyes for signs of guilt, her footsteps for patterns that no longer matched the rhythm of a faithful partner. Some nights I woke up and found her sitting in the living room, staring into the dark with her phone screen lighting her face, and when I asked if she couldn't sleep, she would force a smile and say she was just reading messages from a colleague in a different time zone. I kept telling myself I needed solid proof before making assumptions, so I decided to wait, to watch, to gather every detail until the truth revealed itself in a way I couldn't ignore. On Sunday, after church, she spent almost the entire afternoon outside talking on the phone behind the car, and each time I stepped out, she lowered her voice and turned away, as if shielding the conversation from the wind. That evening, she apologized for being distant lately and said stress had been affecting her mood, and she asked if I trusted her, looking me straight in the eye with a softness that almost made me forget the doubts rising like smoke around us. I said I trusted her because saying the opposite would have opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through, and she nodded with relief that felt too quick to be real. I started checking the small things, the scent of her clothes when she returned from errands, the frequency of her showers, the way she arranged her handbag like she was hiding something at the bottom. It amazed me how love can make silence feel like protection, even when it's slowly suffocating you, and how suspicion can grow even when you refuse to water it with accusations. I noticed she started spending more time on Instagram and WhatsApp than usual, always clearing her chats before leaving her phone on the table. And when I asked jokingly if she was texting a secret admirer, she laughed in a way that sounded like someone choking on air. I found myself listening for unfamiliar ringtones, watching for names that made her flinch, and even tracking the changes in her breathing when certain messages appeared on her screen. During a family gathering at her sister's house, I caught her stepping outside to make a call, and when I followed quietly a few minutes later, I heard her whispering in a tone I had never heard her use with me, a tone layered with softness and caution. When she came back inside and saw me near the doorway, she forced a cheerful smile and asked if I wanted more food, and I simply nodded, too stunned to form the question swirling in my mind. By the end of that week, I could no longer deny the tension between my desire to trust her and the instincts screaming that something was slipping away. Even when she held my hand in public, her grip felt lighter, like someone pretending to remember how affection works. Our conversations became shorter, filled with practical updates about bills, groceries, and schedules, but missing the laughter and ease we once shared without trying. I began to wonder if I was losing her slowly, or if I had already lost her and hadn't realized it yet, and that thought kept echoing through my mind as I watched her move around the house like a polite stranger. There were moments when I almost asked her directly if there was someone else, but each time the words reached my throat, they dissolved like sugar in hot water, leaving only bitterness behind. I told myself I needed patience, that the truth always finds a way out eventually, and I began to prepare my heart for whatever it might reveal, even if I wasn't sure I could handle it when it finally arrived. I began to notice things that shook me to my core, not subtle hints, but glaring signs that my mind could not simply dismiss, no matter how much I wanted peace. Her late nights suddenly multiplied, and when I asked, she always had quick explanations about work, church meetings, or friends' gatherings that strangely never included me. One evening she came home with a faint trace of lipstick on her blouse collar, a shade she never wore, And when I pointed it out, she laughed too nervously, claiming it must have been from hugging a female colleague. Another time, I caught a whiff of an unfamiliar men's cologne on her scarf, the kind that lingered boldly as if the man had been far too close for comfort. She began to guard her phone as though it was gold, sleeping with it under her pillow, flinching whenever a message beeped, and rushing to the bathroom to reply. At first, I told myself maybe she had surprise plans, maybe even a gift she was hiding, but deep down my chest tightened with dread because I knew these weren't the patterns of love, they were patterns of secrets. One Saturday morning, while she was in the shower, curiosity gnawed at me and I picked up her phone, only to find it locked with a password I didn't know, something she had never done before in our years together. My hands trembled as I placed it back quickly, fearful of being caught, but the seed of betrayal grew stronger in my mind. She had receipts tucked in her handbag that showed expensive dinners for two at restaurants I had never been invited to, the kind of places we used to dream of going together when money was tight. When I asked about them, she smiled and brushed it off, saying she sometimes treated her cousin or a girlfriend, but I could hear the crack in her voice. On another night, she returned home with her hair slightly disheveled, clothes smelling faintly of alcohol, and her laughter forced, almost rehearsed. I wanted to believe her, to trust her, but every fiber of my being screamed that something was happening behind my back. The lies grew bolder, but so did the evidence. One afternoon I found a hotel keycard in her handbag, branded with the name of a high-end place in Victoria Island, a place neither of us had ever visited. My stomach turned violently as I held it, but when I asked, she claimed it was left there accidentally by a colleague she helped carry a bag for. The excuse sounded ridiculous, yet she said it with such confidence that for a moment I wondered if my doubts were making me paranoid. The following week she came home with a new gold bracelet, one I hadn't bought her, and when I inquired, she casually said a friend gave it to her for her birthday. The problem was, it wasn't her birthday. Her explanations began to weave into a net of contradictions, and every time I tried to pull one thread, she grew defensive, angry, accusing me of not trusting her, flipping the blame until I felt guilty for even asking. It was a cruel game, a silent war where truth was the battlefield, and I felt like I was losing. Still, I couldn't ignore the signs. One evening, after she fell asleep, I checked her purse again and found a receipt from a hotel bar, dated just 2 nights earlier, with charges for champagne and a 2-person meal. The name signed on the bill wasn't hers, but the handwriting on the tip line was strikingly similar to hers, a flourish I had seen many times in letters and notes she wrote me. My heart pounded as I imagined her sitting across from another man, toasting under dim lights, laughing in ways she had stopped laughing with me. I wanted to confront her that very night, but I hesitated, afraid of the answer, afraid of hearing her confirm what I already knew in my bones. I told myself maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe I was reading too much into things, but the truth lingered like smoke after a fire. The more I watched, the clearer it became that my wife, the woman I trusted with my life, was slipping away into the arms of another. And in that realization I felt the foundation of my world begin to crack, leaving me standing in the middle of my own home as if it was no longer mine. I sat in the darkness of the corridor, half hidden by the shadows, while she moved around the living room with the confidence of someone who thought the night belonged only to her. The silence of the house stretched across the walls like a thin sheet of glass, fragile and ready to shatter with the slightest truth. I heard her footsteps approach the sofa, slow and unbothered, as though guilt had never touched her skin. The faint glow from the lamp laid a warm haze over the furniture, and I could make out the soft movements of her hands as she reached into her purse. I kept still, my breath controlled, my heart heavy, but no longer racing the way it used to when I still hoped I was wrong. She exhaled slowly, the way someone does when they believe they're finally alone with their secrets. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and I could see the faint smile tugging at the edges of her lips as she pulled out her phone. The room smelled faintly of the vanilla candle she lit earlier, the same scent she used to fill the house with when she loved me without deceit. I leaned slightly forward, silent as stone, my face unreadable and my body cloaked in the kind of stillness that comes when a man has already survived the pain. She typed something quickly, and the soft tap of each letter on the screen sounded louder than a knock on the door. I didn't need to know who she was messaging. The rhythm of her fingers was too familiar now. I watched her tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, that same subtle movement she once reserved only for moments of sincerity. My eyes drifted to the corner of the room where the wedding portrait used to stand before I removed it, though I never told her why. The air in the living room felt thicker than before, as though the walls themselves were waiting for me to finally break the silence. She shifted in her seat, crossing her legs and leaning back into the cushion, completely unaware that the night had already betrayed her. I listened to her hum an unfamiliar tune, one she never sang around me, and the sound of it scraped something deep inside my chest. Every second she spent unaware of my presence felt like a rehearsal for the moment I would speak her name without warmth. I could see the faint reflection of her phone screen in the glass table, and the glow lit her face in small flickers. She laughed under her breath at a message, soft and private, and the sound felt like a whisper against a wound. I swallowed the urge to confront her with fire and chose instead to let the cold in my voice do the work when the time came. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing precision, each second marking the distance between who we were and what we had become. I rested my hand on the armrest of the chair I had taken earlier, letting the leather press against my palm until it stopped trembling. Her posture relaxed deeper into the sofa, like someone enjoying the comfort of betrayal without consequence. The weight of the room pressed on my shoulders, but I held my composure with the patience of a man who no longer feared the truth. She sighed, as though exhaustion came from love, and not lies, and that was the moment I realized how small my presence had become in her mind. The curtains swayed slightly from the wind that crept in through the window she forgot to close. I remembered how she used to scold me for letting the night air in, calling the cold a thief of comfort. And yet there she was, inviting it without thought. The irony sat with me in the dark like an old friend. My fingers curled around the edge of the chair as the decision to reveal myself grew steady in my mind. I watched her place the phone gently on the coffee table, her smile lingering like a stain. She rubbed her palms together, perhaps from the chill, perhaps from the thrill, but I no longer cared to interpret. The lantern-like lamp in the corner cast a soft circle of light around her, but none of it reached the shadows where I sat. I wondered briefly if she would feel fear, shame, or anger when she realized I had been listening long before tonight. The silence pulsed with the weight of my restraint, and I let it fill me like armor. The floor beneath my feet felt colder than usual, though it could have been the absence of denial warming my blood. I could hear the distant rumble of a passing car outside, the world continuing as though my life wasn't splitting quietly in half. She leaned forward and scrolled again, her lips parting slightly as she read whatever he had sent. My jaw tightened, not from shock, but from the confirmation of what I had already accepted. There was a time I would have coughed or shifted to make my presence known, hoping she would stumble over the truth and admit it before I had to drag it out. But that version of me no longer existed in this house. The lamp flickered slightly, and for a moment I imagined the light exposing me without warning. She brushed invisible dust from her skirt and looked toward the hallway for a fleeting second, though not long enough to truly see. I inhaled slowly, steady enough that not even the darkness dared to echo it. The distance between us was more than just the space in the room. It was years of trust dissolving in silence. I thought about the first night we spent in this living room as newlyweds, when her laughter filled every inch of the space like music. Now all that lived here was the echo of that memory and the shadow of another man's presence. She picked up her phone again and typed with a softer expression, her eyes lighting up only the way they used to when she looked at me. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not to hide, but to remember the man I was before suspicion turned to certainty. The darkness behind my eyelids felt kinder than the sight before me. When I opened them again, she was still smiling, still lost in the lie she thought was safe from discovery. I straightened my back, preparing to step out of the shadow, not with rage, but with the finality of quiet truth. The room held its breath with me, as though the walls, the furniture, and even the night itself knew the moment had come. I let my hand drop from the armrest and rest gently on my knee, a silent signal to myself that the waiting was over. She shifted again, unaware of how close she was to the end of whatever version of us still existed in her mind. I listened to her breathe, steady and soft, as if loyalty still slept beside her. I stood slowly, letting the faint creak of the floorboard announce what my voice had not yet spoken. She didn't react at first, too absorbed in whatever words were glowing on her screen to notice the shift in the air. The creak faded into silence, but I stayed standing, letting the weight of my presence settle like a storm cloud behind her. My shadow stretched across the floor and touched the edge of the light, but she still didn't look up. I took one step forward, measured and deliberate, and the sound of my heel meeting the tile finally broke through her bubble of comfort. Her head turned slightly, slow and careless, as though expecting nothing more than the wind playing tricks again. When her eyes fell on me, the first thing that left her was the smile, slipping off her face like it had been borrowed and suddenly recalled. She blinked once, twice, disbelief layered over fear, before she could weld expression into something neutral. I didn't speak immediately, and that silence trapped her more effectively than any question could. She shifted upright on the sofa, her fingers brushing the phone, as if instinctively searching for an anchor in the lie she had lived. I watched her throat tighten as she swallowed, the muscles in her face fighting to compose what the heart already betrayed. For a long moment we only looked at each other, the distance between us filled with all the words we hadn't said. I let my gaze fall to the phone, then back to her eyes, and she followed the direction of my stare like someone walking into a confession booth. She opened her mouth slowly, maybe to greet me, maybe to lie again, but I raised my hand slightly, and she froze, with the breath still trapped between syllables. The lamp hummed faintly in the quiet, its light no longer warm, just present. I walked around the edge of the center table and came to stand where she had no choice but to face the truth without turning away. She tried to smile, a weak, practiced curve that never reached her eyes, and asked why I was awake with a voice pretending to be soft. I didn't answer her question because the night had outgrown the need for distractions. Instead, I asked her if the message she sent made him smile the way she used to smile at me. Her lips parted again, this time without words, and the lie she wanted to speak died before it formed. I lowered myself into the chair across from her, not sitting back, just leaning slightly forward, my hands resting on my knees in calm certainty. The silence swelled, no longer empty but ringing with everything she feared I knew. She fumbled for something to say, her fingers drumming against her thigh in a pattern that betrayed her panic. I watched her glance at the hallway, as though measuring the distance between escape and admission. When I finally spoke again, my voice was low and even, the kind that comes from a place beyond anger. I told her I had been awake long before tonight, long before the messages, long before the change in her scent when she returned home. Her jaw trembled at the mention of details she assumed were invisible. She whispered my name like a plea, but I didn't answer with comfort. I asked her if she remembered the promises we once made in this same room, under brighter lights and honest air. She looked down at her lap, unable to hold my gaze, now that truth had stepped fully into the center of the room. I could see her wrestling with whether to deny, confess, or collapse into fragments of justification. I leaned back slowly, not to relax, but to give the truth enough space to echo properly. The night outside pressed gently against the windows, but not even the darkness dared interrupt what was unfolding. She asked how long I had known, her voice barely standing on its own legs. I told her the exact date my trust died, and the exact moment suspicion turned into proof. She covered her mouth with her hand, a gesture I once found delicate, but now read as desperation. The phone on the coffee table vibrated with another message, and the sound sliced through the room like a blade. She stared at it without touching it, the guilt in her silence louder than any confession. I didn't need to ask who it was, because every beat of her pulse answered for her. I stood again, not abruptly, just with finality, and she flinched as though movement itself had become a verdict. I told her that tonight wasn't about discovering the truth, but about acknowledging it openly. Her eyes glossed with the first signs of tears, but I didn't move to comfort her the way I once would have. I spoke her name the way a stranger might, distant and stripped of tenderness. She tried to close the gap with apologies, but the words stumbled from her mouth without structure. I remained silent and let her speak, letting every excuse and half-admission fall flat against the memory of who we once were. She said she never meant to hurt me, and I only nodded slightly because intent had long lost its place in this story. The ceiling fan above us spun lazily, but the air in the room remained heavy and unmoved. I walked past the coffee table and picked up the phone without looking at her, not out of curiosity, but because symbols matter more when the truth has already spoken. She sat with her fingers curled into the cushion, her shoulders small beneath the shadow of consequence. I placed the phone back down and told her I didn't need to read a single word to know everything I had to know. Her tears finally fell, quiet and unaccompanied by sobs, but they landed in a world where they could no longer purchase forgiveness. I reminded her of the day I asked her to choose me every day, not because I feared abandonment, but because love requires loyalty when no one is watching. She looked at me then, really looked, and saw there was no path back through the door she had closed behind her. My hands were steady, my breathing even, and the tremor she expected in my voice never came. She whispered again, this time asking what would happen next, and I didn't answer immediately. I let the quiet stretch, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement of what could never be restored. I told her that the version of me she knew had ended the moment she chose secrecy over honesty. She wiped her cheeks with trembling fingers, the weight of her choices settling into her bones. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse, I didn't demand. I simply stood there and let the truth carry its own consequences. The night no longer felt cold because numbness doesn't measure temperature. She asked if there was a chance to fix things, to rebuild, to start again. And I met her question with silence, so absolute it became the answer. The lamp glowed softly behind her, casting a weak halo over a moment that no longer held any sanctity. I told her I wouldn't stain my dignity with a performance of reconciliation. She looked at the floor then, and the distance between us became something even words could no longer reach. I walked toward the hallway, my footsteps slow but unshaken. She didn't follow, not yet, maybe because the weight of shame had pinned her to the sofa. I paused near the edge of the corridor and told her that the night would remember us differently than we remembered ourselves. She closed her eyes, and I could hear the breath leave her body as though surrender had finally found a home. I didn't slam any doors or raise my voice because truth, when finally spoken, requires no theatrics. The silence that followed was not empty, but complete. I left her sitting in the warm light of the living room, surrounded by the echo of a love she thought could survive deception. The house didn't feel like mine anymore, just a place where trust had come to die. And in that quiet, final moment, even the walls seemed to understand that everything had changed forever.